Hello, everybody. Probably not very many of you today on this wonderful spring summer day. It feels like summer here, but it's still spring until St. John's Tide. But I'm having my coffee, and I see that David is drinking something. I don't know what it is, but that's okay. I'm sure it's probably coffee. He has that Turkish obsession with he gets Turkish coffee. My coffee comes from South America, but I have to say that Turkish coffee, I think, is actually better. And that being said, I'm sure everybody isn't checking in to talk about coffee, but I'm just giving people an opportunity to stroll in at their own pace. So, any regard, today is the 44th episode of What is Truth? The perennial question. And here we are, we're on a quest to try and improve our questions. And that's all we could possibly hope for, as we've perhaps demonstrated so many times, and that the shortfall on a conceptual basis is where we must needs make our departure. And so I have to bring up something here. We are currently going through a bit of a dilemma here. Let's see, where is it? As Mercury is retrograde in Gemini. That's from May 29th to June 22nd. So we're still under the auspices of having things frequently not go according to plan. So I made extra effort today to not get befuddled by this contrary nature of retrograde Mercury in Gemini. But that being said, I'm sure that that'll haunt us nonetheless. And I wanted to bring up something here. It's from Kurt Gödel, or Gödel. And Kurt Gödel, he was a remarkable figure. And he was very much an important figure in regards to the domain of logic. And he was born in April 28th, 1906, and died on January 14th, 1978. But he was a logician, a mathematician, a philosopher, and he's considered, along with Aristotle and Gottlob Frege, to be one of the most significant logicians in history. And getting into that whole domain of set theory and Georg Cantor and Dedekind and all those figures. And when Einstein agreed to come to the Princeton Center for Advanced Studies, he said that the reason he accepted the invitation was so he could walk home afterwards and talk to Georg Cantor, or talk to Gödel. And so Gödel is a fascinating character because he attempted to find the construction of what we would consider logic or understanding and the way things can be proved, and coming into, ultimately, he resolved himself in what's called the incompleteness theorem, and the paradoxical statement, this statement cannot be proved. And he actually took that and converted it into a mathematical formula, which I won't belabor you with. But if you just think about this statement cannot be proved, that's a good one. or the contrary nature of this statement is false. Well, if that statement is false, then it must be true. But if it's true, then the statement is false. See, so you're going to end up chasing your tail, basically within the realm of the mind and the domain of mental constructs in an effort to find the answer. And that's what we've been struggling with for some time. And it's almost unavoidable if you want to get to Rudolf Steiner's ideas regarding that challenge. You can sometimes find stimulating thoughts in the most unlikely lectures of his, and one of which I find very stimulating is it's concerning the origin and nature of the Finnish nation. And it's included in a cycle of lectures, Man's Connection with the Elemental Worlds, Finland, and the Kalevala. And that was in November of 1914. But in there is embedded some very important aspects of trying to understand this dilemma, because he gets into trying to understand. And by the way, if you want to find this lecture, you'd have to go to the podcast version of Rudolf Steiner's lecture cycles and look for Collected Works 158, because it's not posted on YouTube as of yet, but you can also find it, portions of it, on the Rudolf Steiner archive that's maintained by my friend, and I hope you'll support his efforts. But it has been published, and there's a version that came out of Rudolf Steiner Press in London. But that being said, let's return to our subject. So in the Kalevala, there's three primary characters that are involved, and Rudolf Steiner says that they represent the inherent nature of the soul of the ancient Finnish people, that they would have a threefold view of the being of soul, and that it was encoded within the Kalevala. And by the way, I think that the best translation is the Crawford translation. Blavatsky agrees with me as far as English translations. And I looked around, I couldn't find my copy. I wonder if I let it go. It's like the sea of books that surrounded me for most of my life. And things come and go. But in any event, in there, he says that the three characters that are the primaries of the Kalevala represent attributes of soul. And so you have Vainamoinen, which is that the sentient soul is inspired by Vainamoinen. That's like the human divine essence, or the human heroic essence, inspires through dreamlike inspirations. And then you have Ilmarinen. And Ilmarinen, he represents the intellectual soul or mind soul that's worked out of the etheric body, just as the sentient soul is worked out of the astral body. And so you have Ilmarinen, and you can look upon the intellectual soul, and this is the only place I've seen him typify it this way. He refers to the intellectual soul or mind soul as the inner architect or master builder, which is very intriguing comment that we could perhaps make some gestures towards. But in there you have Ilmarinen, and he's the intellectual soul is the smith or forger of the soul, as Rudolf Steiner characterizes it. And it's represented in the Kalevala as the forging of the Sampo. And that's an important theme that's in there. That's that mythic, dramatic event where Ilmarinen forges the sampo, and he actually brings together all the various elements to be able to consolidate this mysterious sampo. And then you have the third aspect of the soul that's inspired by the character Lemminkainen. And he represents like outward knowledge connected with the life of the senses. And what he in essence represents is enabling the human being to conquer the physical plane. So you have the in-streaming inspirations represented by Väinämöinen. Then you have Ilmarinen forging the sampo, that which becomes the containment of that soul nature. And then you have Lemminkainen as that which can now reach out to the external world, the physical world. And so that's a very interesting thing, but he couches it in something very cryptic, because he says that, that this nature, this threefold nature dwells just below our everyday consciousness. And he says, which is a good thing. And he keeps in mind that to approach this, and he mentions his book, Knowledge of Higher Worlds and Attainment, and he says that to approach this, there are certain conditions that have to be met to be able to get a wholesome result. And so this isn't something that you just want to stumble into. Now, the other tendency is the concept of seeing the soul as a unity. And so you have these two tendencies of seeing the soul as threefold and seeing it as a unity. And he says that the custodian of that relationship is this mysterious hidden one that's referred to by the name of Skythianos, who's one of the principal Rosicrucian teachers, and he's concerned with connecting the various mystery streams. And so you see this whole concept of being able to bring diverse things, diverse tendencies and developments together, and to be able to harmonize the various esoteric streams, so that you have Skythianos anciently being prominent in the mysteries in Ireland in the early period. And there's legendary accounts of people traveling from as far away as India to go to the mystery center in Ireland. And so you have this deep event happening. And then you have his role in establishing the mysteries in the north, the mysteries of the Drotens, or the Germanic aspect of that impulse, the Jupiter mysteries there. So you have the Jupiter mysteries in Ireland, the Jupiter mysteries in Northern Europe, and then you have on the shore of the Black Sea, Rudolf Steiner talks about how he founded a mystery center there, Scythian mystery center there, and that was very prominent, and that actually mentions that St. Francis of Assisi had experienced an incarnation at that mystery center. And then later, you also have the influence on Manet, the founder of Manichaeism, receiving the books of Skythianos from it was left to his mother. So this whole idea of the widow, the son of the widow, harkens back to that whole drama. And so you see that indication there, and you also see that there's this threefold unity that's present. And I'm not saying that this individual is Skythianos, but he's approaching these mysteries. I'm not, of course, either saying he's not, but you have Dionysius the Areopagite, who I mentioned so often, the first bishop of Athens, who was in Egypt at the time of the crucifixion and noticed the eclipse event, and upon meeting St. Paul, questioned him about those events, and he realized that it synchronized with the event that he had experienced while he was in Egypt. And in the writings of Dionysius the Areopagite, here's my favorite edition, and that's the John Parker translation that has almost all that's available out there as far as the actual texts and references to the scholarly apparatus and all that kind of stuff. I'll no doubt be sharing some of that later in one way or another. But you see within there that there's this kind of Neoplatonic sensibility, and in the terms of Plotinus, and that Plotinus is always talking about the one, but then he talks about the threefold relationship to the one as the good, the true, and the beautiful. And so you have this consolidation of these types of themes. And keeping in mind the context that Rudolf Steiner had said that the lecture of the teachings of St. Paul, of which there's some 13 of the books in the New Testament. So it's actually the most prolific writer in the New Testament. But that these were specifically pointed towards regions where the olive tree grew, which is an interesting kind of telluric remark. But that whole idea of telluric relevance is very much akin to Old Testament thinking, in that Moses has his like revelatory events have to do with an actual interaction with the material world. And so you have in Moses that he, strikes his rock and water comes out, or the burning bush, or revelations occurring on a mountain. It's always something that has to do with that whole idea of the kingdom of the physical nature, the actual geology, so to speak, in a sense. And so, in getting to an understanding regarding all of that, how one might reconcile monotheistic thinking and Trinitarianism. Monotheism, a strong tendency in the East, in the Orthodox Church, the idea of the Father, and then in the Western Church, the unique place of the Son in relationship to the Father, and the ideas of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And so that's some of the things I've been thinking about on approaching today's little chat. How you doing there, Reverend David?
That's a good question. I've just come from our Pride service, so I'm a shattered man at the moment. No, always good to chat with you, John. I noticed two things I've not noticed before. Your forehead makes you look like a Venusian, an all-wise Venusian on these broadcasts. So I'm even more gratified than usual to be talking to a wise and learned sage. And the other thing is, I love your preambles. I really love the preambles. Where do I start with all of that? God, I remember getting a copy of the Kalevala. You're in a sea of books. I would be in a sea of books if I hadn't known so many bloody thieves who helped themselves to books in my collection and never brought them back. So I should be surrounded by a sea of books, but I'm not. I asked Watkins Bookshop in London years ago, hi to everyone in Watkins, if they could find me a copy years and years and years ago. And some young woman nearly killed herself managing to locate one. Thank you. Also, I was told by our wonderful friends in Shakespeare and Company in Paris, they are difficult to get hold of, but I knew that. I got my copy, found it incomprehensible, noticed something odd, that the heroes, you're looking at something very non-Greek. the shaman heroes of that book, Wainamoinen and Jokinen, they were trying to overcome each other with the power of their incantations. So it's really a non-valorous view of what makes courage and what makes manliness. I mean, I don't want to go down the whole route of, is manliness a constructed thing? Partly yes, partly no. But it's such a non-valorous. The Greeks wouldn't have recognized that as anything heroic. It wasn't by the power of their muscles. It wasn't by the power of their sword or their shield that they managed to overcome each other. In fact, the Greeks would probably have thought that was sort of a nasty, sniveling, little non-heroic thing to do. So I remember that it came out years later. We put on, what was the name of that? With Dr. Minna, I can't, darling Minna, if you ever listen to this, I can't remember your surname because it was so incomprehensible. We put on with the University of Helsinki at Birkbeck in London a Quest of the Heart seminar. It lasted over 2 days, where you got some scholars at the university, and so she was responsible for getting the scholars. I was responsible for getting the arty people, because we were trying to see what the interface was between one type of creativity and another type of creativity. The scholars really depressed me mostly, apart from the Finnish, the Finns, who were just absolutely bewilderingly odd. I mean, one of them was one of the most important professors of Stoicism on the planet, Simo Nuttila. I'm sorry, Professor, if you ever hear that, who went around winning golden medals of excellence everywhere. As some of you know, one of my obsessions is Ibsen. So it came to me to talk about Ibsen, and I was going on and on about The Doll's House and Nora. And what I was dreading actually happened. During Q&A, his arm was raised, and I thought, oh God, one of the planetary experts on Stoicism is just about to ask what I think about Nora. And I said, yes, Professor, what is interesting you? And he said, oh, it's all so depressing, isn't it? So you've got one of the global experts on Stoicism telling me Ibsen's depressing. I know that. I feel a little out of my depth dealing with that type of shamanism. Certainly, I do go along with the fact that some of the purists say shamanism is actually quite a distinct word and only really belongs to certain areas in Central Asia. I sort of go along with that. Therefore, what would you call these characters if they weren't shaman? And then you get into all sorts of ugly retranslations of that, which I don't want to go to. But I mean, the fascinating, very non-Western material. As I say, from what makes a hero and what doesn't make a hero, from the prejudices of the heroes to the mercies of the heroes, what the spirits will go along with and what they won't, which is hardly ever mentioned in the Western material. There are things the spirits simply don't approve of, and how they fit it into their own local communities. They're figures outside their communities because they've got these extraordinary powers. Could you really live next door to an Elizabethan magus? The answer is no, you couldn't. Because what are they going to do next? So the answer is no, you probably couldn't. But they were also, unlike Western societies, they were very much part of their community. There was this weird double edge way of looking at what those magical arts are and what they're not. I mean, a lot of it reminded me of our favorite chestnut on on this show, Astrotheology, because nearly everything always seems to come back to it, and it's got its finger in the pie nearly everywhere. So yeah, what am I thinking about at the moment? I'm thinking about I'm suffering from the Pride Service. I'm thinking about where is all this going? Because for me, the quest for truth isn't discovered through the machinations and the prowess of heroes. I suppose it's discovered in those that look for that Zen moment of enlightenment and overcome the world itself. I'm thinking of the Tirthankaras in certain types of Jainism, the foe destroyers. They've seen through the entire material universe. They are liberated. I'm thinking of Theravadin saints, bodhisattvas, as opposed to Mahayana saints and bodhisattvas. These relentless individuals that claim they've seen reality as it is. And I suppose the shamans, I think they know it's there. I get the impression, if I read that material, they're very aware that there are these noumenal ultimate states, and they simply don't want to discuss them, which puts, for me, their materials in a very uncomfortable position, and I find myself uncomfortable, if not intrigued, when I'm reading them. So yeah, I suppose that's my initial reaction to today's to today's proceedings, John. I will hand back to you. I have a slurp of. Actually, it's water. I have hot water for this show. I made the mistake of having an iced coffee just before I was due to give a sermon and an interview, and felt myself choking for 10 minutes through both. So I'm playing this safe, and I'm on iced water. Hot water at the minute to keep everything going. Anyway, I'm handing it back to you, John.
Yeah, well, I used to enjoy. I haven't lately, but it's a ancient Chinese method for concentrating one's qi. Your life energy is to get really hot water and sip it very, very slowly, and that can bring you back, so to speak. So that's a method, which is interesting because that's coming out of a Central Asian milieu. Yes, shamanism is actually a word. I believe, what is it, Tungu? I can't remember right now, but it is really tying into the Turanian peoples, of which the word Turkish is derivative. But the Finns are Ergo-Tartic people, and so that they're cousins to the Hungarians, and they have those connections. But in understanding the tendencies of certain mystery streams, you always have to conceive of the region in which they developed, which is alluded to by Rudolf Steiner when he says those cryptic words regarding St. Paul, that his mission was in the lands of the olive tree. And so you see in the Kalevala that you have three prominent bodies of water reaching into that region, and that plays a special role. And elsewhere, you get into his characterization of the development of folk souls and their relationship to the elemental world. And this particular lecture cycle I'm referring to regarding the Kalevala has to do with the relationship of the elemental world to the configuration of humanity. And so when you get into understanding that, and you see that, like, civilization centers, that as civilization developed, that it was near bodies of water that these types of events really occurred, with a certain character that is very revealing regarding the nature of those people. And so you have, for example, you're in the British Isles, and that you're on an island surrounded by water, seafaring people. And then you have the what I just mentioned regarding the Finns, and then you have Italy, the boot surrounded by water. But yet, when you look at it and you say, well, where are the spirits of water most prominent in the European folk soul community? See, it's in France that the French were the ones that were so connected to the spirits of water in the configuration of the intellectual soul, which is so prominent in the French culture, whereas the sentient soul in Italy, and the consciousness soul in England and Germany. And so you see that there's this, there's no simple answer to these questions. You have to say, well, in what way do you mean that? And so when you get into like saying that, you kind of bounced off of some of the adventures in the Kalival, I'm not surprised. These things are difficult to approach when one approaches them purely from an abstract point of view. And Rudolf Steiner frequently makes the case that it's one of the great shortfalls of modern scholarship is its tendency to trying to resolve things into abstractions, and you get into going back to what I said in the beginning, this statement is not true. Okay, well, if this statement is true, then it's not true. And so they have a tendency to want to find closure. And that is kind of the dilemma of the consciousness of entropy that science dwells in, that due to their formulations, they computed the universe and they figured out that what's going to happen is everything's going to just kind of collapse into entropy. That's their end game. That's a very ignoble goal for anybody who would follow that one down. But that they're working their best to make it true, and but you mustn't get caught in the negative spin on some of these things. I frequently return to Friedrich Freiherr von Hardenberg, a novelist. And I've quoted this before, but it's such a good one, I'm going to quote it again. When it has become clear to us that the world is God's kingdom, when this great conviction has once penetrated our minds in its infinite fullness, then we go comforted along life's dark path and contemplate its storm and dangers with a deep divine peace. And so I'm with him. And so when you look at some of these things and you see that there's these adventures, or what we might term as misadventures, that these things are there for a specific reason, and that they are teaching something of which we no longer have the faculty of necessarily penetrating into what the author thought he meant. And so in getting into this and getting into the understanding of what he's representing here, or attempting to represent, Rudolf Steiner says that there's two fundamental aspects that are kind of like the midwives to being able to bring about this harmonious 3-in-1 development. And one is the mystery of Golgotha, of course, because that is the source of the actual substance that has to be integrated into a harmonious way. And then he ties in the Master Scythianos as being a custodian of the way in which this has to happen, and also being that which pushes into the background that tendency until it arrives in a wholesome way. Because we're one to just go into pieces without consolidating your own individual essence wouldn't be necessarily helpful. And if you look at some of the philosophers that have attempted to bring this about, and that's why I mentioned Kurt Gödel, he spent a lot of time in a sanitarium. he had a problem. He had a real problem, you know, and he was afraid somebody was going to poison him. So toward the end of his life, he refused to take food. And so you see, and he's a really a remarkable. I mean, when he was a young man, he spent his time contemplating Goethe's theory of colors, and he perceived that Leibniz, which was more wholesome than the other guy, you know, Isaac Newton, and it's interesting because Rudolf Steiner says about Newton and Leibniz, he says that if you study calculus from Leibniz's point of view, it's healthy, whereas coming at it from Newton's point of view, it's unhealthy. So you see a characterization there that's very important because it's also the distinction between Newton's theory of color and Goethe's theory of color, and that there is a very subtle distinction, and it's possible to arrive at a certain vantage point with a different equation, so to speak, you know, with a different process, and that in the Newtonian sense, it's kind of like that which is moving into granulation and the separation into components. Whereas in Goethe, you see that this whole idea of building the bridge that is holding it together, and that it's this enlivening etheric capacity that is so healthy in that regard, and brought Goethe to aspire to be a Hypsisterian, that he included in his revered company pagans, Jews, and Christians all together. And again with St. Augustine saying that, referring to the Christians before the time of Christ, is that there were people that were connected to the Christ mystery before the event happened. So you have the various prophetic streams that Rudolf Steiner gets to, and I'm not going to deal with them right now because that would entail a great deal of dialogue. But nonetheless, in coming to understand these cryptic remarks regarding these mysteries, and in looking at Dionysius the Areopagite and his whole development of the celestial hierarchies, it's three groups of three, which is your whole company of the archangelic, the angel, archangel, archai, all the way up through the whole series of celestial beings that are the beings that have brought this into our experience. But yet man would like to think that there's just some kind of mechanism of nature that's just grinding the universe out, and that there's this kind of somewhat happenstance series of physical events, and everything regarding perception and all of that is just the end game of some kind of chemical process, some kind of mechanical chemical. And so you have this whole view, and that's what contaminates so much of our human culture today, and we're dealing with it specifically now, that there's like some kind of laboratory experiment that's going to improve the human condition. And if you go back to Paracelsus, he says that all substances are poisons, and so that you have to be able to derive a harmonious relationship between the world of events, and that it's hearkening back to Zarathustra in the late Stone Age, making the pronouncement that evil is good happening in the wrong place and time. And so you have this whole idea that balance. And in one of Rudolf Steiner's lecture cycle, he refers to to love as balance or harmony, and that it's has to do with being able to find one's place. And that's what makes it difficult, because people want to retreat into the Orient and whatnot, and they go, "Oh, well, I'm Zen," meaning I'm too tired to think right now. But that's good, is that you have to, like a quote I put on Facebook the other day of Morihei Ueshiba, the founder of Aikido, and that he's such an exponent of that type of process. And you should be able to get to that state in meditation, which in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, although a lot of Americans say Patanjali, but that's kind of like Captain Jolly, but it's Patanjali. In the Yoga Sutras, where he says that meditation is the cessation of the modifications of the mind. And so taking the mind and bringing it to a point of rest, but keeping in mind that tradition itself is a tradition that has born out of such an early post-Atlantean culture, the first post-Atlantean period of the Manu and the seven rishis. And so it predates the introduction of the fourth principle coming into its own through the mystery of Golgotha. So that, of course, in their system, they're looking for this whole idea of nirvana as a non-existence. It's that I'm finally going to be able to take a break and merge with the all, which is nothing kind of perspective, which is very popular in New Age circles. But yet the destiny, the esoteric Christian destiny, is far more intriguing and is encoded by St. Paul as ye shall be as the angels. That when we finish with earth evolution, that we're not going to cease to be and just merge into the bliss of Godhead, but that we are going to become active participants in the development of the future cosmos. And so that in working through angel, archangel, archai, the whole series, just as all those beings in every level of hierarchy has it some just distant past, so far back and beyond timelessness. Yet they went through a fourth stage similar to ours, in that they had a fourth stage in their dynamic evolution, but not that it's the same as ours. That ours is said to be unique in that we have the capacity to fail, as is so strongly asserted by the mystery of birth and death, that we're so deeply incarnated into this physical world that we see ourselves as entirely separate from the company of divine spiritual powers. And so until we gain that separateness and consolidate as an individual being, then we can return to the perception of these things in a wholesome way by following the guidelines as laid down by Rudolf Steiner and other initiates of that particular path, which is the Western path. Whereas in the East, they'll come to that, but that'll be further in the future if they don't get to it now, because it's not a part of the body of literature. And so you see it in Blavatsky. She's always railing against this whole idea of that you want to kind of negate the principle of the ego. It's that there's no abiding principle and all these kinds of things, because those tenets are not expressed in the Eastern text. It's just not there. But yet there's a very exalted presentation of the higher principle, the Atma Buddha Manas, spirit, man, life, spirit, and spirit self, the higher triad. That is a unity in the entelechy of the human being. Oh, I just had interesting image change there. Who knows what that means? But in that being said, so this is all very good, and it's an intriguing adventure, and I would hope that people would take to heart that the intimations by Rudolf Steiner how important reverence is in approaching these matters, because he says it's one important thing to begin to do is to try and go to sleep with a mood of reverence, and try to wake up with a mood of reverence to the divine spiritual powers, and see if you can pull that one off, especially the one waking up, because it's so often the case that we're railing against the world in our first encounter with an alarm clock or what have you. I don't use alarm clocks, by the way. But that being said, we're here with Reverend David William Parry from the city of London, merry old England. He's the author of Mount Athos Inside Me, Essays on Religion, Swedenborg and the Arts, which is edited by Daniela Irandus, the talented young man. That's his principal work. All of his works are available on Amazon. And here is his Shakespearean study, The Grammar of Witchcraft. No, it's not about witchcraft. It's about Shakespeare and his Shakespearean-esque poetry, Caliban's Redemption. And all three of those books, like I said, are available on Amazon. There's links included below that can get you there. And for my books, my first book is 640 pages, The Arcana of the Grail Angel, The Spiritual Science of the Holy Blood and of the Holy Grail, a study developed out of the work of Rudolf Steiner, the underground streams of esoteric Christianity which flowed from the Brotherhood of the Holy Grail to the Order of the Knights Templar and the True Rosicrucian Order. And it has a foreword by my best buddy, Douglas Gabriel, and has many, many diagrams, as does my second book, The Arcana of Light on the Path. And this has a foreword by my old friend, the late William Bento. And in both of them are included my series of Grail diagrams that attempt to try and present the cosmological aspect of Rudolf Steiner's work, anthroposophy, a star wisdom, astrosophy, so to speak, that is gleaned in large part from the works of Aaron Pfeiffer, who was one of the young circle of people that was able to sit at the feet of Rudolf Steiner, and he ended up becoming the founder of biodynamic gardening in the United States, and was interesting in that out of the circle of people around Rudolf Steiner, he was one of the individuals that concerned himself more with ancient Egypt, whereas so many in the circle around Rudolf Steiner concerned themselves more with the mysteries in Mesopotamia, and the whole powerful series of events leading up to the events in the Old Testament and Abraham and that whole mystery. But having a mythopoetic relationship to the mysteries of Egypt, Aaron Pfeiffer actually went to Egypt and attempt to try and work out some of the indications that were given to him individually. And so there's things that are to be found in the work of Aaron Pfeiffer that you're not going to find elsewhere, because it was something that Rudolf Steiner had said to Aaron Pfeiffer. So it's kind of like it's a missing link in the education of a lot of anthropologists. But that being said, my books are available. You can get them on eBay. But because these eBay links don't work on all platforms on YouTube and on Facebook, I included my academia link below. And by the way, you can download for free a PDF of the foreword to my Arcana of Light on the Path, which does a nice explanation of my first book, The Arcana of the Grail Angel. And that foreword was written by William Bento. And so that being said, you can, if you're outside the US, contact me directly through the academia page, or you can contact me by private message on Facebook. Boy, it takes too long to do all that. There's also, if you want to buy us a cup of coffee for going to the trouble of having a conversation in front of you, there's paypal.me/DPARRY777 for Reverend David, and paypal.me/John Barnwell 888 for myself. So that being said, we have to keep moving forward with this. This is 44. That's quite a geez, I don't know how to describe it. It's almost a climacteric. But 44 episodes of people patient enough to sit through our chin wagging, as you would call it. So I have a nice little story I want to share. I'm into sharing nice stories, and here's a nice story I should share. But years ago, I knew a remarkably gifted rare book dealer who I've made mention of before. He's the one who would build a collection of rare books on a particular subject. You know, first editions, best bindings, everything like that. He would read them, and then he would sell it as a collection. And one day I went into his office, and his name was Larry, and he has since passed on, I'm sure. But that being said, he showed me this wonderful drawing, and he held it up in front of me, and he said, "I bet you know who this is." And he held it up. And this is something that's not even known, that even to anthroposophists, that this particular individual was talented in this way. And I mean, it was absolutely the drawing of a master of the head of Christ. And it was about a yard long and maybe about 20 inches high. And it was just, one would think it was written by or drawn by Raphael. It was so well executed. But it was by a guy, it was signed Christian Oser. He says, "I bet you know who that is." And I said, "Yeah, that's the father of Carl Julius Schroer. His name is Tobias Gottfried Schroer." And Larry said, "I knew it." He said, "Well, I need to get that drawing from you. What do I got to do to get that drawing?" He said, "Well, I can't. My mother loves it. She wants to put it over her couch." So out there somewhere is this wonderfully rendered head of Christ by Tobias Schroer. And that's interesting, because in getting into Rudolf Steiner's destiny himself, Carl Julius Schroer was a Goethe scholar that became a teacher for Rudolf Steiner, and he was the one who assigned Rudolf Steiner to be the editor in the Kirchner edition of Goethe's scientific works. But it was the mission of Carl Julius Schroer to really make prominent the literary works of Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. And Rudolf Steiner had said that because he was incapable of succeeding completely in that task, that Rudolf Steiner had to take up that task himself. And so you see that the Goetheanum and the culture surrounding the Goetheanum ended up coming about. But Tobias Schroer, the father of Carl Julius Schroer, is even more obscure, but yet he was very significant, and it wasn't even known in what way until after he died. And because there was a series of books by Christian Oser, through which Christian Oser was known, not by the drawing, but because of certain repression that were happening at that time. He wrote under a pseudonym, kind of to protect himself and his family. But he had a real Goethean view of the world. And so he did some books that were very significant in German culture. Letters on Aesthetics, Chief Objects of Study. And then he also did Little Greeks, and also World History for Girls' Schools, and other books. So he did all these books, and it wasn't until years after his death that the Schiller Institute was going to award something in the memory of Tobias Schroer, that Carl Julius Schroer came there to receive the reward, and that was when he revealed to the world that his father, Tobias Schroer, was Christian Oser. And so people didn't even know it until he announced it was some, I don't know, maybe 19 or 20 years after he had passed away in the middle of the 19th century. But you see, Schroer having difficulty, and Rudolf Steiner characterizes it, is that this Platonic soul, in the strongest sense, was trying to grapple with the Platonic world of ideas. And he said if he would have been able to make the transition to see that as not just being ideas, but actually being beings, spiritual beings. And you see that that's the dilemma of so many in philosophy. I remember, excuse me for a second. I remember a philosophy professor that I came to meet from the University of Toronto. And it said that he had a bit of a nervous breakdown in contemplating wholes and parts and regarding to the whole Platonic theory of ideas and all of that. And you see that the stress that happens when you attempt to try and gain an abstract relationship to these things, it weighs on you, like the way it weighed on Carl Gödel.
Gosh, that's a lengthy speech. I have to think how to respond to. Oh gosh, yeah. Right. Let me say first off, anthroposophy is so cool. I'm very proud to be a member of the society again. It's incredibly cool. Secondly, I'm privileged to actually know J.P. Sears, ultra spiritual, who of course, a little unfairly, rips into the New Age movement. And some of his, I believe, in real life, he actually is a counsellor. But the character of J.P. Sears, I mean, the trouble is, I know people like that. Is meant to be a gag, but the trouble is, I know people like that. You know, and I noticed in the early videos, he'd be different people commenting on his thought, and you get ultra spiritual saying something, you know, it's all about becoming one with the cosmos. Then you'd get someone who looked strangely like him holding a Bible saying, look, it's about getting entry into heaven. So and then you go back to ultra spiritual again. So of course it's exactly the same thing, but using different vocabulary. And oh no, you're a bit harsh on Zen. I mean, I because they can write voluminous philosophical tracts when they want to. I think, you know, and I use them, I suppose, as a juxtaposition because I can't quite think. And as you know, I'm a Hegel nut. I can't quite think of a Western equivalent, you know, in the sort of easily recognizable sense, apart maybe from the Quietists or Quakers. I mean, maybe them. You know, that say very little, but you end up feeling like you've had a body blow directly after they shut their mouths. You know, oh my God, where did all that come from? and John has now disappeared from the screen, which is what makes me incredibly nervous every time that happens. So what do? Right, I will talk about the mysteries of the Trinity. I don't know exactly why people, thank God his image is back. I don't know why people get their knickers in a twist. We're monotheists. We're monotheists. The end. Right. Yes, there's a mystery called the Trinity, but we're monotheists. That's the point. So I never know quite where. I know people do get in a palaver and stuff like that, but oh God's sake, you know. Particularly because you said something really interesting a bit earlier about the prophet Moses. You know, and there's a sort of, is it? I mean, not simply theosophical, is it? There's an ancient mystical idea, of course, of the one life coming from the one source. Perhaps they're synonyms. And it's really the one life on many different levels that we've got to discover, that we've got to discern in ourselves and in the environment and in the higher realms around us. You know, so it never surprises me. I don't think it's simply for dramatic effect that the prophet Moses is in a particular environment, and I don't mean that's done for poetic reasons. Although, of course, what would be wrong with that if you're trying to convey a very complex truth in a simple way? What would be wrong with giving an image? It doesn't mean the complex truth is null and void. It means you're struggling to give a very complicated piece of information in a way accessible to all. Certainly the fact that the prophet Moses starts interrogating a burning bush that tells him, I am, you know, you've got to start thinking, well, hang on. So Moses, the prophet Moses, is identifying as the core energy of the universe, as the one life. That would make him a prophet, I think. That makes him way, way high up in prophetic status. And of course, puts a very different glint of steel, literally, on Jesus's answer before the Sanhedrin, that I am that I am. You end up with this sort of multiplex reaction to the one life, the one soul that's permeating, guiding, creating, being born by itself on so many different levels. So I rather find these sort of anthropomorphisms telling. I mean, you mentioned a couple of mathematicians. I mean, I like Cantor. Cantor, what was it? Transfinite mathematics. Rumor on the street has it that he started going mad when he was thinking of infinity times 6. Yeah, get a life, man. Get a life. You know. Have you had a cup of tea? You know, have you met your mates recently? Get a life. You know what I mean? And you know, it's fascinating. And you've got to think, well, yeah, all that abstraction, and it's making you get a bit unhinged. Maybe it can be done in a different way. And maybe that's through trope, maybe it's through symbolic image, and maybe it's through, you know, images that are lived in real life that are also symbolic. I can't quite see this, unlike Kierkegaard for once, I can't quite see this either or when it comes to scripture. For me, it's a multi-leveled stream of teachings that must be addressed in a multi-leveled way. Is there a level appropriate for the Cantors of the world, these great logicians, mathematicians? Of course there is. I think the mistake, and maybe that's my lack of skill sometimes in expressing that, you know, it's not an either or, because I love reading Hegel. I love reading Hegel, and I find great justification in Hegel, but I don't look for any new technique in Hegel. What would Hegel have done? He'd have said his prayers as a good Lutheran. You know, so I suppose I'm worried myself. You know, keep things simple when you're dealing with the ultimate extremities of of complication, because really that's what we're asked to do. Which is why I love the Zen stuff. You know, these stories which are deliberately designed to disarm. I can't think of any of the patriarchs that would have said, "Don't read those books." None of them. And you get I get the impression that it's a lot more genuine than Tibetan Buddhism. With no disregard, I'm going to army of Tibetans round to the house now to beat me up. I can't say. Not that I'm having a go at Tibetan Buddhism. If you want to know about occultism, those boys know everything. And if you want to know about the intricacies of visualization and mantra recitation and all the rest of it, go to Tibet. That's the motherland of magic and mysticism and esotericism. But it always struck me that the Zen boys, they could do all that, but they were down to earth, and there was something honest. There was something honest about them, like Moody Bodhidharma, used to tell people to sod off if they annoyed him. That strikes me as something very human and something compatible with the modern situation, maybe. But temporarily, I'm reminded of what was it at the beginning of the myth of Sisyphus by Camus? Zeus. We all know who you're getting at, love. It is temporarily indisposed. We all know who you're getting at, love. And maybe he'll come back. Actually, he never went, but that's a different argument. And you think, well, the existentialists who I love to a man, to a woman. Sorry, Simone, to a woman as well. They've got the Zen-like simplicity, but they don't deliver. That's why I think the Zen people are unique, and they need to be seen as this sort of counterbalance to the endless theorizations which may or may not lead somewhere. I think there are a number of ways to get to the higher worlds. Steiner covers all of them. You get this sort of Hindu romanticism where you get these wonderful complex myths, or you get Tibetan bodhisattvas where it's all rich text and there are colors and there are incense and there are stars and there are plants and this weave of connections and associations. And the idea, I think, is to lift your consciousness up stage by stage until you're on that level of awareness that the writers themselves are claiming to inhabit, or at least inhabit sometimes. Or there's that sort of plain man's speaking. I'm looking at a tree and it's beautiful. That strikes me more like Moses looking at the burning bush, actually. He's looking at something that happens regularly in the Holy Lands. The fires come out of those rocks and stones a lot of the time because of the geology and the chemistry of that area. Lots of bushes get burnt all the time. Ask the people that live in those terrains. The difference is maybe that the prophet Moses suddenly saw something in a new way. Therefore, you're looking at Zen. Is the prophet Moses capable of talking about these vast abstractions? Obviously. But at the same time, maybe he's saying, whoa, slow down, take a step back. What are we seeing? What are we experiencing? What is it that will transform us? Is it this rich mythological structure that lifts us up with the wings of an eagle? Or is it something more immediate, like a punch in the mouth? All right, you nearly got past me, John Barnwell. I suddenly remembered. Good old Isaac Newton. A Brit. Oh, God, I love Leibniz. How long was his powdered wig exactly? I should have lived in those times. A powdered wig would have suited me to the ground. And all his mates at the Sorbonne, and the French are also bloody posh all the time. That would suit me to the ground. I think what Steiner's picking up there is, certainly there's an elegance in Leibniz that's found nowhere else, and it's to do with the mathematics of the period, and it's just beautiful, and it's gentlemanly, and you could imagine sipping mint tea afterwards and telling your servants to have the afternoon off, so you can see all that. But Isaac Newton was this force of nature. Some people have said the last magician, and if you look at his writings, they're like books of shadows more than books of theorems. He's testing stuff out here, he's pushing something else there, he's writing theology one minute, he's practicing alchemy the next. And I have stood on the shoulders of giants to see what I've seen. I think he means the alchemists. I don't think he means the Aristotelians. So yeah, I mean, I'm going to stick up for sort of skinny Isaac Newton for once, because I think you need both types of thinking. I would love to be at the Sorbonne with my powdered wig. I confess that, but I quite like the idea of this force of nature running around testing things and causing trouble. I mean, that also strikes me as an incredibly important contribution to the way knowledge works in our world. What does Cantor miss? Then I'll shut up. There are different types of epistemology. There are different ways to pick up knowledge. And is that what we're doing? In other words, being lifted up on the wings of an eagle to higher states? Or are we meant to be in the immediacy of the divine? Right, one more thing. What was it, Nagarjuna in Tibet? I mean, he was walking along minding his own business, and someone slapped him round the face, and I'd have been there too. And all of a sudden, he realizes he's one with the universe. Is that story meant to be taken literally? Who knows? The point is, you get the immediacy, the shock, the instant realization of what it is we are and where we're meant to be in life. And I'll hand you back on that incredibly long and drawn out answer.
Oh, was that an answer? You could have fooled me. Well, maybe you did fool me. I thought it was a question. Anyways, yeah, I think I don't mean to put forward disparaging ideas when I make distinctions. It's just that in the East, it's a different tradition that developed in a different time period, and that there are certain stages of evolution expressed in the body of literature and the traditions themselves. And that's the thing that misses the perception of most authors that deal in the realm of scholarship, thinking that the Egyptians were just like us, only they didn't know what we know, and that there is no evolution of consciousness. They don't realize that the Egyptians are dealing in the realm of the sentient soul, and that it's something that they experience as streaming into them. And you get into the next period of the intellectual soul, they still were able to have a meaningful relationship to their existence before they were born. And that's whole idea of when you get into what Rudolf Steiner said regarding the Kalivala, and that the intellectual souls as being the builder, when you see, well, of course, because you see that it still has a relationship to coming into being. So out of God we are born, in Christ we die, through the Holy Spirit we are resurrected, right? But in getting into understanding the mysteries in the West, Steiner spoke about Skythianos in reference to him coming together with the initiate Zarathustra and the Nirmanakaya, or spiritual form of the Buddha, and the Mani, or Manu, great Manu himself in the 4th century. And that was the actual conference out of which the Rosicrucian stream was born. And so you look at that and you go, that's a pretty important project. And so you see this mysterious, hardly ever mentioned character. Carl Jung says, he refers to him as that cursed Skythianos, and everybody's, it's like a habit of scholarship to rail against Skythianos, that he's the problem child because he's the origin of Manet's so-called dualism. But yet you understand in taking this, just as there's the coming into a harmonious relationship of the threefold nature of the human soul as it pertains to the one, likewise in this version of dualism, you have to be able to resolve that there's a third aspect to it. And so that, like in Lao Tzu, for example, you have the symbol of Taoism, which is the dark and the light coming together, but in the center of each of them, there's a dot of the alternate color, so that yin is contained in yang and yang is contained in yin, and it's seen as a spiraling thing. It's like the spiraling faux hot, so to speak, the primal force. But in getting into exploring this, if you get into, you're talking about the Tibetan stream, and that's really interesting in that you get to some observations that were made by Douglas Gabriel, who I don't know anybody else that made this connection. And not saying that Scythianos is this individual, but there's a similar thing in that in the Tibetan stream, there's a hidden master, the unknown master, so to speak, and that's Tompa Shenrab's Miwoche. And he is seen as the source waters for Bong. And Bong is the pre-Buddhist tradition, shamanic, you could call it, of the Tibetan people. And in a conversation I had with the Dalai Lama's cousin, Gelek Rinpoche, we discussed the relationship of Bong to Tibetan Buddhism. And he said that you have to understand that the artistic embellishments within Tibetan Buddhism, that is a carryover from the tradition of Bong. And that Bong is this Tibetan folk experience, and when it embraced Buddhism, it integrated the Buddhism with its own tradition. So you have these incredible works of art, the Tibetan tankas, those images, and the tapestries, and the ritualism, and all of that, as being an inherently a Tibetan carryover from the tradition. And mind you, this Rinpoche that I'm speaking to, he's talking about a tradition that goes back. It's like what you're talking about, Tompa being, according to some sources, 10,500 years ago. So that's a very, very archaic Atlantean transition to the post-Atlantean period. And so you have this toward the end stages. And so, but yet again, it's a tradition that doesn't include the integration of the I am that is present in the Christian stream. And so you see that within that tradition of Buddhism, you have the 12 bodhisattvas, and above the 12 bodhisattvas, the Adi Buddha. And you could see that the primal inspiration of the Adi Buddha being the Christ. And so it does all integrate together. And as to Zen, I don't mean to disparage anything about Zen, because I have a great love for it too. And actually, the first metaphysical book I ever read was Alan Watts, a book on Zen, and but nonetheless, you have to understand that they knew things, but they just didn't talk about it. That's not what you're working on right now. They try to get you to the threshold to where you can get to the cessation of the modifications of the mind, which is the fundamental guideline of the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, which is absolutely at the core of the whole take on the esoteric path as far as the East is concerned. And so that's to be venerated, and there are those that's their path, and that's fine. People in that region of the world are actually more suited for it because that's where they are. It's more difficult to achieve the success here with kind of a pop culture version of all that, you know. But I wish them all the best. But that being said, we're getting near the end, and this is always an interesting point in our conversation. I'm not sure if we figured anything out, but I think we've raised further questions, and that's a good thing. And so if you could, please, David, give me whatever your closing remarks are and share with us one of your prayers for consecration of this wonderful event with all our friends here.
I should have said response instead of answer. My humble response to your wonderful tapestry. I'm bound to think Christianity is unique and somehow privileged and somehow more pertinent to the human condition than before then and now. You know, and as I say, I use the word Zen, I suppose, as shorthand because there are equivalents. But if I say George Fox, people don't know what I'm talking about. Or if I say Quakers, they sort of know what I'm talking about. If I say Quietists, they most certainly don't know what I'm talking about. Half of them have them down as weird heretics that don't agree with my church, you know, because of priestly disorders of a different kind. Also, I think, yeah, I mean, the types of direct experience that were cultivated in the West obviously have a Christian flavor. Therefore, I think, you know, you're dealing with something a lot more complex from the beginning, and it really needs you need to be in the presence of someone as opposed to you know, looking at these things in abstract, in abstractio. But maybe I'll try and modify that for next week. I have to try and think of a shorthand that suits everybody. Yeah, I read Patanjali many years back. You know, anyone that says you don't get textbooks on magic hasn't read Patanjali. They're really very, if you do this, that will be the response. What was it, the 8 Yoga Sutras? I can't quite remember. You know, so, and yeah, I quite like him. It's like one of my old Latin masters. Have you done your homework? Have you done your homework? Well, no, you won't be able to do it if you haven't done your homework. So I rather like Patanjali because I'm sort of on familiar territory there. But you know, we're coming to the end of our show, and I'm sort of browbeaten by the events of today. So what I want to do is, I suppose, you know, say something I was saying earlier during our service. Let's be nicer to each other. You know, all of these ideas, all of these wonderful ideas, wonderful books, wonderful thinkers, and they are. Don't get me wrong. My dear friends, my dear friend John, listeners, they are wonderful. Don't get me wrong. And make them even more wonderful as a road leading to the Christ within. You know, it strikes me that this generation that seems to feel it's more free than any other generation, in so many ways is actually more imprisoned than people have ever been before. And they're imprisoned by narrow bands of consciousness, narrow views, narrow this, narrow that, in a quest for the types of answer the world simply will never deliver. So let's remember to be kind to each other. We never know what's happening in somebody else's life. Let's be kind to each other because everyone has a hard trot at the end of the day. And let's build bridges in our kindness to find the Christ within each other, and the Christ that surrounds us. And may that light of Christ bless you in the days ahead until we get to next week's show. Amen.
Amen. And as a added thing, I want to send blessings of peace to our friends in Jerusalem and the surrounding area, that they may be able to reconcile their differences without the endless machinations of all of the power brokers in the world. So let's hope that those things can find a peaceful resolution. And thank you all for showing up, and I hope to see you all next week.